Parfait, bonjour.
C'est un plaisir.
Santé, président.
Merci les gars.
Bonjour et bienvenue au cadre de Stratégie. Préférez-vous les instructions en français? Do you prefer the instructions in English?
English, please.
Each team has 24 minutes to present its case to the judges. The time is indicated on the timer as a countdown. In case of a problem, I will indicate the remaining time visible first. The first 12 minutes are protected. The judges cannot interfere during that period. The next 10 minutes are not protected. The beginning of this period will be announced with this bell. When the not protected period, the period will end. I will ring the bell again. The judges have the possibility to interrupt the presentation during this period to ask clarification questions about the subject addressed at that moment. The judge has 15 seconds to ask his question, and the judges can only ask one question per side. The team needs to answer the question, but can resume the presentation without the judge's permission. The judges cannot ask questions on subjects that were already covered or that were not presented yet. These questions should be addressed during the period of questions. The last 2 minutes of the presentation are protected and should be used to conclude the presentation. If you do not end your presentation after 24 minutes, it will be stopped to move on the period of questions. A period of questions of a maximum duration of 5 minutes is assigned to the jury at the end of the presentation. I would like to remind the jury that it's mandatory to ask at least one question during this period. Please note that you cannot reveal the name of our studio at your university, as you may be disqualified. I would like to ask the public to turn off their cell phone, and I will now invite the judges to introduce themselves.
Hi, my name is Lucy Rodriguez. I'm the National Director of Talent Management for Metro.
Hi, my name is Catherine Desgagne-Bézil. I'm Vice President of Business Solutions in Centre de services partagés du Québec, Shared Services, Québec Government.
Santé, Sales Director, Procter & Gamble.
Hi, my name is Raphael Sampson. I wrote the case with Jérôme, and I'm also a teacher at Cégep Lévis-Lauzon.
Jérôme Perrault, Financial Controller, Société d'assurance automobile.
Jean-Philippe Magnan, Consulting and Administrative Director, Société de l'assurance automobile du Québec.
Whenever we get into a car, we're taking risks. We're taking the risks of bodily harm, mental damage, or even worse, death. But whenever a risk materializes and we are hurt, we know that we can rely on the SIAQ to be there and ensure our needs. But the SIAQ itself takes on risks as well. For example, most recently, the CASA project that has been undertaken by the Société to overhaul its computer technology systems. It carries significant risks of budget overruns, risks of delivery beyond the scheduled deadline, risks that the public is not happy with the final product. And who's there for the SIAQ to make sure that when those risks might materialize, the SIAQ can preempt them and mitigate them and make sure to survive regardless? My name's Noah, this is Tamara, and this is Rachel. We've formed the N-Sites Group consulting firm, and we're here to advise the SIAQ on our recommendation for how the SIAQ can address these budget risks and make sure that in the long term it's ahead of the innovation needs that are asked of it by the Quebec population. First, we want to define what our ambition is for the SIAQ. What we want to do is identify specifically what of the values of the SIAQ will we be addressing in our recommendation, what's within the scope of what we want to solve, and what will we leave untouched in this presentation. But then we want to define where are we going to play when we try to solve these problems that SIAQ is facing. The problems of making sure the budgets don't go over cost for their recent projects and projects going forward, making sure that the second line of control within the SIAQ is able to effectively control operational managers in their decision making on a day-to-day basis. And then finally, we want to articulate how are we going to address those issues. How are we going to reshape the way the second line operates, how the SIQ thinks about its projects to make sure that those risks do not materialize. And then finally, we'll define what capabilities will we use to be able to carry through with our recommendation. Now, let me start, as I said, with our ambition, defining the scope of our project. Rachel?
Sorry. So first of all, we're going to look at what the ambition of this project is. So SIQ is really undergoing a huge transformation with the CASA project and the implementation of an ERP system, a new technology. And essentially there's three main objectives that we define as being really the most important. So firstly, we want to consolidate the process to create more efficient control systems and decrease risks of overruns budgetarily, but also from a cultural or even a human perspective. Next, we want to define the organizational control plan across all the second line portfolios, which was really the ask in the documentation, and we're going to address that thoroughly. And then finally, the implementation of innovative initiatives to ensure the SIQ stays above the innovation curve. So the SIQ is way more than simply an insurer. They're there for the Quebec population whenever they get into their car, and for most of us, that's every single day. So we want to make sure that the SIQ stays innovative. Next, we're going to look at our impact. So we've identified an impact of $738.6 million in overruns avoided. So we really took a perspective of really avoiding costs. And then finally, this leads us to our opportunity. So through our three-part strategy, the SIQ will be able to deliver the CASA project on budget, as well as on time, setting itself up with the internal controls and capability for long-term sustainable success, which is really the key here. So, first of all, where's Chloe?
So now, let's make sure that we're all on the same page on some of the terms that we're talking about. What is the structure of the SIQ, and what do we mean by first line and second line? So we briefly sketched out the organizational structure of the SIQ as we understand it, where we have the CEO and the C-suite third line of control that oversees the entirety of the SIQ. Then we have the first line of control, which are the individual business units. The individual functions of the SIQ, making sure that license and registrations are handled properly, that assurance is distributed, the money is collected. All of these functions are the core day-to-day operations of the SIQ. And then on the far right, we have the second line of control, which are the main risk management and planning control functions and services that were identified within the information provided to us. Now, each of these four secondary second line services intersects with all of the different vice presidencies of the operations of the SIQ. Ideally, what we want is that these services, quality assurance, for example, is able to interact with each of these operational fields or portfolios and make sure that they're holding them to account on the quality of the products they're putting through. When we look at a project like the CASA project, when, for example, the VP of roadside checks wants to add a new online function, we need to make sure that quality control is coming in, seeing the product early, making sure that it's up to snuff and up to the right standard, and we don't find out at the end of the project that we didn't get delivered a product that we didn't want. So now we want to identify who are the main stakeholders for the SIQ. In our research, we articulated three key stakeholders. First of all, Quebec drivers. These are the people that interact most directly with the SIQ, and they have high expectations and they deserve high quality service from the SIQ. They deserve to have up-to-date 21st century services online or available in whatever means, language, and function that they desire. But then the SIQ also has to take into account the stakeholders of its employees. We have a lot of employees within the SIQ, thousands, and when we implement a new project like the CASA project or a new computer system, new ERP, anything really, we need to make sure that the employees' concerns are being addressed and the employees are given the tools to make sure that the project comes through correctly. But we don't want to just give them high demands and not help them hold their hand and guide them through the process. And then thirdly, the SIQ obviously has obligations towards the public at large. We have environmental and long-term financial sustainability requirements, but we also have more immediately the concern of how does the SIQ spend taxpayers' money? We need to make sure that when we engage in big overhaul projects like we're going to be focusing on in this presentation, we are not wasting the public purse and spending 3 or 4 times what we initially projected for the expenses of the project. Now, what is the key problem that we face with the CASA project? Now, on the left-hand side, you can look at similar projects that were undertaken in the past by other government agencies, projects of overhauling computer systems or changing key functions within the organization. And all 3 of these have gone vastly over budget. On average, between the ones that are most close in size, within hundreds of millions, the CASA project we're looking at, the average between those 2 is 2.5 times over budget, which means for every dollar we plan to spend, we spend $2.50. Now, we don't want that kind of situation to replicate itself within the SAQ, but we're well on the way to that happening. If we look on the right-hand side, we can see that although our spending budget for both the ERP and tech environment aspects of the CASA project have achieved high percentages of use, the percentage progress so far is actually quite low comparatively. If we can continue on the current path, we expect to be equally over budget as those previous projects that we have observed in other organizations.
So now let's take a look at how to win for our strategy, because we really want to address these problems that we saw and then come up with solutions to mitigate against. So the first of which we looked at was our challenges. So what is the main challenge that we're facing? Is that we're looking at common and potential overruns associated with very long-term and technological implementations. And so how we wanted to mitigate against that challenge is that we really wanted to define the role of the second line and the control in order to ensure long-term effectiveness and efficiency of the transformation. And how we're going to do so is we're going to do through a 2-pronged strategy in which we're going to implement a separation of power and an iterative agile methodology, and in which we're going to really revamp the second line. And so we're going to control and enhance the level of accountability of the vice presidencies and ultimately increase efficiency and effectiveness. Our second prong of our strategy, when we look at the challenge that we face there, is that we really want to address the lack of experience associated with the new ERP system that CASA, which is going to be implemented, impacting the organizational structure. And so how we're going to address that is we're really going to define the organizational control plan to take into account roles and responsibilities of all the stakeholders. So what that means is that we're also going to do this through a CASA strategy, and this strategy is really going to be the implementation of an organizational control related to each individual sector that Noah outlined earlier, and it's going to be different functionalities applied to all vice presidencies in order to ensure community, accountability, scrutiny, and assessment, in which we will delve into more later. And lastly, we're going to address the challenge of the need to be recognized as an effective and innovative public insurer. And so we really want to stay above the innovation curve here. And how we're going to do so is that we're going to ensure SIQ's ability to adapt to the environmental changes in the long run. So this is definitely going to be more sustainable. And then while maintaining a positive and relevant image both internally and externally, so for the employers and for the people in Quebec, so your drivers. And so how we're going to do so for this strategy is that we're really going to create and develop an innovative initiative so that the implementation of educational components as well as disruptive technologies can be implemented in order to ensure SIQ's long-term sustainability as loyal partners to these Quebec drivers. And as a result, all of these 3 different pronged strategies will result in an impact, as we mentioned, of a saving of $738.6 million in overrun costs. So now we're going to take a look into the first prong of the strategy, which is really to define the role of the second line. And so if we take a look at how to win here, we're going to create a sustainable iterative process to really ensure the efficient implementation of CASA across the second line. And so how we're going to do so is that we're going to create, I guess, a 2-pronged system, where the first of which is that we're going to ensure separation of power to make sure that everything is standardized and fair. And the second one is going to be an agile methodology. So this is going to be an iterative process so that if there's a problem that arises, we're going to be able to fix it right away and continue on this process through. So they're going to be mini processes throughout the long haul process. And so we're going to really increase the effectiveness and efficiency in the implementation of CASA. And so this will really prevent budget overruns on CASA and really ensure successful rollout of CASA essentially and the ongoing risk controls that we've seen through our information that we were given. So if we really want to look at the first separation of power, and so our first pillar, we're going to really ensure integrity through a system of checks and balances, essentially, to create accountability and transparency throughout the organization itself. And so the first pillar, it has 3 different, prongs within it as well. And so we're going to implement a clearly separated functions within the second line of control, just to make sure that things are standardized and that everything can be kind of benchmarked and accounted for. Our second of which is going to hold accountability within and amongst different portfolios through a set standard established by our upper management. And then our last of which is we're going to create a steering team to really periodically check the functional roles of the second line and ensure implementation. And then benefits here, as you can see, are the first of which is to ensure accountability, as we said, to make sure that each individual portfolio, they mitigate the replication, and so that reduces costs and in the organization to really increase effectiveness. And so our second benefit, we would create transparency within the organization so that our second line can ensure consistency and quality. And then lastly, we're going to guarantee implementation of the system in a fair, flat, structured system with uniform standards. So basically what this is saying is that through our defining the role of the second line, we're really going to make sure that each person and each portfolio is accountable for the standards that are set by the upper management. And we're going to do so through this. And so secondly, we're going to create an agile methodology. So what this means is that we're going to create a sustainable iterative process that will really ensure effectiveness and efficiency through our implementation. So this will help create, standardization and save costs in the long run. So what you see here is an agile software development cycle. And so all of these cycles will be implemented throughout the long process. So for example, the VPs will come up with or the upper management will have, a meeting, and then they'll tell the VPs exactly what they want and how they want it to be implemented. Then the VPs will deliver it, and then they'll come back to reconform to see if there's any issues, to do an evaluation, and then if it checks out and is clear, you continue on. And so you have a lot of different checkpoints and different cycles within the project so that if something arises and there's a budget overrun, we can address it right away to save all those sunk costs instead of going to the end of the process and being like, oh, we've messed up here and we need to fix it, but there's already a huge sunk cost because they've already been developed. And so here there's a ton of benefits as well, so just addressing 3. The first of which is that we're going to create ownership within the individual portfolios. We're going to manage performance with the VPs and mitigate against ineffectiveness and some costs.
Yes, so jumping into the second prong of our strategy, this is really the CASA strategy, so the organizational control plan that we developed. So first element is really the community. So we want to develop an online community portal. And the idea here is to implement Yammer. You've probably heard of it. It's the Microsoft Suite Office social network for enterprises. And it's used often within larger enterprises that are looking to have more of a community feel. So employees will be able to safely share their tips and recommendations regarding quality assurance. So this is really looking at quality assurance, what's going on, are people, is there anything that's not going so well within the organization, and maybe there's things that could be doing better, and employees at the front line are usually the best to know this. And then finally, the development of a community manager position, so an employee that's already in place that will be able to relay recommendations at all levels of the organization. And then the benefits of this is to create a larger sense of accountability. So if you know that you're able to go speak to a manager about something that's going wrong or that's going right, you really have a bigger sense of ownership. And then finally, it will facilitate whistleblowing and prevent corporate misconduct, which is sort of the underlying idea here. The second is accountability. So we want to ensure high standard budget and accounting practices within the second line portfolio. So here we want to look at requiring applications for approval whenever budgets run over, using SAP's ERP finance component of their solution that's already part of the base solution to really track any and all changes, and require an online justification before the approval any budget that goes through. So this is pretty standard practice, and it's to ensure that this is kept consistent throughout all portfolios. Next, the benefits. So this will mitigate overspending. It'll be able to change company cultures. Employees will be able to understand really what money means, and it will help them manage their spending, quote unquote, and then facilitate each VP's management of their own portfolio from a budget perspective because everything's being tracked in the ERP. Finally, scrutiny. So we want to ensure compliance with the controls that are put in place. This is really the performance prong of the second line portfolio. This is really having internal ad hoc checks of the various controls in place, just making sure that everything's done properly. Facilitation of open communication between the employees and managers throughout the daily scrums, which is what Rachel mentioned in the implementation of the Agile methodology. And then finally, the use of rewards to ensure compliance. So here we really want to look at positive reinforcement to enhance long-term compliance with controls. We want to ensure that these are properly implemented and then have an overall sense of trust and internal community, which is an underlying theme throughout our recommendation. And then finally, assessment. So this is to ensure investigations are conducted as efficiently as possible. This is sort of underlying. Investigations are not done necessarily all the time, but when they are done, we want to make sure they're done properly. So something that we looked into was that the SAP ERP actually has their HIM, Human Capital Management, element of their technology, which is in the base product, just like the finance is. And so we're going to leverage this to automate the HR process, to have a seamless integration with the existing SAP ERP, and then really avoid human error, lower cost, stay up to date with changing HR regulations, which can be a huge problem with organizations that have antiquated technologies, and then finally enhance overall staff productivity. Finally, the third prong to our strategy is the education and innovation component. So this is a bit of the fun component that we want to make sure that SAQ is staying up to date with the newest trends in innovation and technology. So first of all, we want to ensure social responsibility towards the external community with the 6,003 employees that they have to keep up to date with the changing external environment through education. So this will take the process of workshops on the new technology. We want to make sure people understand the SAP UX, they're able to use it, and they're not necessarily just going to go back to these loopholes or old ways, because in organizations that are large, like the SAQ, sometimes antiquated systems stay, and this causes huge problems. Next, we want to overall limit the use of paper by ensuring that employees are comfortable using technology. Once again, they don't go back to using paper instead of this great ERP system that they have. And then finally, these workshops are going to really limit dependency on the external consultants. So this is a huge cost that they have, so 200 consultants currently on the project. Moving forward, we want to make sure that the internal employees really have the ability to do the work themselves. Finally, innovation. So SAP has great AI capabilities. This is not necessarily something we want to do tomorrow, but this could be a great way for SAP to really step up their innovation game and be able to mitigate risks, mistake related to compliance, as the AI will be able to track these changes automatically. So by implementing the RTDE, it will allow the organization to become more productive with their use of data, which was something that was really brought up in documentation, and that's an overall trend within the space.
It's a famous truism that sometimes you have to spend money if you want to save money. And in this case, this is how we thought about the finances of our recommendation. Basically, I won't go into too much detail, but for each of our 3 parts of our strategy, we have certain key costs that will be involved, especially running workshops where we bring in employees. First of all, in the first part of the agility workshop, the first part of the strategy, the agility and separation of powers. So when we separate the second line powers from the first line powers, and then make sure there's an agile feedback system between the two of them, but to teach them how to actually do that, what kind of meetings and who should be the touch point for whom, and what kind of things should they discuss, what's maybe not within the scope of what they should be talking about, just to make sure that's efficient. But basically, those workshops are obviously going to be major costs for us. And then in the second key strategy of ours, we have ad hoc checks where we want to pay the second line control to go and check in on the operational business units. So we've got a number of different business units, but we want to have, almost like as a food inspector might come to a restaurant, we want these control parties to come in and check on how quality is progressing, how performance is on the budget, and aspects like that. And then third of all, for the ongoing innovation, to make sure our employees are up to date technologically, we need to give them workshops and the tools to perform on that level. All 3 of these cost buckets come out to only a couple million each. But when we compare that to what we expect the total budget overrun risk might be, it's a drop in the bucket in terms of what we want to spend in order to against the costs that we're hoping to mitigate. If we look at, as I said before, the additional 1.5 times budget spend of previous government budgets for similar overhauls, applying that to our budget would mean $740 million in excess expenses, and that's exactly what we're trying to avoid here.
Question, On the second point,
Yeah.
strategy, how do you choose the head of checks? Do you have a preference?
Who does the check, you mean?
Head of checks, which checks do you...
Well, we've got time in there to set up the number of checks and then the number of business units. We saw would basically be enough for each operational business unit to have more than one check in a given year, basically. So the way we see it is that there are 6 key operational units, and if each one of them gets 3 checks in a year, which is already pretty aggressive in terms of what we want to achieve, we could even maybe expect the cost to be lower than that, because 3 checks is quite a bit in a given year.
So now we really wanted to take a look at the implementation and address the 3-year strategy that was kind of outlined for us. And so the first of which is that we want to make sure that our first strategy of separation of power and agile methodology was implemented in year 1, but of course it will take time to implement throughout the system, so we have it through all 3 years. Our second of which is our community and our assessment sections, in which we're going to be implemented in the year 1. Our accountability will be year 2, and our scrutiny will be through year 3. And then our new technologies and educational pilots can be through years 2 and 3 and onwards to the future to really ensure our sustainability. And so just to recap with our key takeaways. And so what we really wanted to address in our first strategy, as we saw, is that we really wanted to make sure we outlined the role of what the second line was going to be. The second strategy, our CASA strategy, was really to define the roles of the second line portfolios and make sure that all of them are accountable and all of them have KPIs that are associated with each individual portfolios with the CASA. And then lastly, we really wanted to make sure that there was a sustainable fund component to SIQ, because we want you to stay above the innovation curve and we want you to succeed not just now but in the future, in the long run for SIQ. So when the Quebec drivers associate anything with SIQ, they want to see that you are a fun, innovative company that really is there for them for insurance. So thank you so much for listening to our presentation. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, it was good to be very honest. Yeah, it was a good challenge. Yeah, good challenge.
You have 2 interesting strategies, and I would like to know, who do you think would be the best to implement each of these strategies? Do you think we should use our own staff? Do you think we should hire consultants, or do you think we should hire new employees for each of your strategies?
Okay, so I'm happy to go through, so agile methodology, we considered this in the finances as well. We think that because a lot of consultancies that you work with, and I believe it's IBM, we looked online a little bit, and I'm pretty sure they use agile as sort of their best case sort of scenario of what they like. So I'm sure they'd be happy to do sort of transformation workshops with you guys to help with the agile. Given how many consultants you already have on the project, like what's one or more less, just to be able to have that long-term sustainability of working in agile, because this is something that people organize consultants for very often. Next, for the CASA strategy, this is something that we want you to do internally. So you guys have the power, you guys have 6,000 employees, and it's really just to implement that those standards within the organization for each of the second line controls. And then finally, from the AI and sort of education perspective, you could really look at the SAP people to help them understand use them to help your employees understand how the UX works and really get them comfortable with it. And then finally, for the AI, this will really have to be A, down the road, B, when people are comfortable with the software, and C, would recommend either going with IBM, since you're comfortable with them, or even the SAP people. They're great. I've worked with them before, so. Yeah.
I do have a question. It's quite interesting in the CASA strategy, the community piece of it. It seems to be a lot technology-based or sort of online and whatnot. What do you do with employees that are like 50 plus or that are less comfortable with technology and so on? Because you're implementing new technologies, helping them understand it through technology. So,
absolutely.
Yeah, that's a good question. So, I mean, first of all, one of the key aspects of making sure the employees are capable of carrying through on these things is having the technology or the educational workshops that we had. That's why we included that in our strategy. If we hadn't included that, we would have basically just been saying, we're going to get the employees to do something, we have no idea if they can actually do it. But then second of all, what we want to do is make sure that with the community of communication, in terms of making sure the project is on time, and the second line controls are being implemented, that within that community, you have opportunities for some of the older employees to learn from some of the newer employees. At the end of the day, the SIQ does not have a choice as to whether or not it becomes more technological or not. So we can't say we have certain employees that don't want to be on board with this. It's a matter of fact that we need to get people on board with that. So with workshops and having a community where people can learn from each other, we think we'll be able to address that.
If I may add to that actually as well, Yammer is MS Office, and most people in all organizations, like I know my mom can do Word, PowerPoint, Excel, like very basic, so it is like a really like a user face they're used to using, so it shouldn't be too much of a big change. It's not like implementing like Slack, which is something that
we're not going to ask the 65-year-old guy in accounting to do the AI, project.
No worries.
Yet again, he could be your best employee.
Exactly.
True.
You talked about the separation of power as something very important. Tell us about why it is so important, the concept of separation of power.
Absolutely. So the idea behind the separation of power is that we really wanted to ensure that, I guess, there's a standard of fairness and kind of a flat structure, so there's a transparency there, so that each individual group, when we're doing, I guess, reviews or evaluations on them, that each of them are accountable for the changes that are happening within the second line. So if we're going to define the role of the second line, we want to make sure that quality assessment, all of the accounting and like finances are all being implemented and being held to the same standard in each of the different portfolios with the different VPs. So having the separation of power and having that objective I guess, evaluation processes makes it very fair and makes the, I guess, the performance much easier to see. So that's why we think it's so important in any organization.
Yeah, precisely. When we're going to have meetings where we're going to ask the VP of a certain operational business unit to tell us how he's delivered on his KPIs, and if we also ask him how good is the product, he obviously has a conflict of interest. And that's why we need the separation of the second order controls.
Thank you.
Good.
Good.